Wheel of Time Season 1 finished last week, and I don't have many feelings about it, honestly, but I have a lot of thoughts, and I'll be sharing those. All these thoughts are coming at you from a non-book reader. I do swim in the fantasy circles, so I have seen a lot of the big major plot points of the series and some of the themes and stuff, but I have actually no idea what's going to happen moment to moment because I just never really got into that level of granularity. Also, I want to acknowledge that because I'm not a book reader, if I raise an issue with something in the show and you have an explanation for why that makes more sense in the books, don't tell me. I don't care. This is a show review, not the book. I understand the book's probably better. I don't care. This review will start spoiler free and then a little bit later transition into some spoiler things to really highlight some of the points that I'm making. This will include very minor spoilers for Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings. You should have seen those already anyways. What are you doing? And a little bit of season 2 of The Witcher, but it's really not a big thing. I'm comparing it to those fantasy greats because clearly, based off the budget and effort put into this, that's what it wants to be. This doesn't want to be a schlocky fantasy campy show. It wants to be good. To sum up my feelings on the first season of Wheel of Time, it would be that it does hit some of those highs that it's aspiring to be from the other fantasy greats. And then sometimes it's as bad as those schlocky fantasy shows that it's also trying to not be at all. This oscillation in quality means that the Wheel of Time is lacking exactly what makes those other fantasy shows great: consistency. The result is a very strong feeling of meh. We'll start with the visuals, and this is a bit of a weird one for me because I can't tell exactly what was the choice of how they filmed it, what was the choice of how they wanted to overlay filters and color correct and these kinds of things, and how much was the actual post VFX things that they add to the shots. But either way, there was this problem where sometimes it felt a little too clean. And I know a lot of people said that about like how the characters didn't have dirt on their faces or stuff, but I mean quite literally and how much was visible to me. I am a film aficionado. I always change people's TVs when I go to their houses to get rid of all the motion smoothing and the noise getting rid of stuff so it doesn't look as grainy. You want that graininess when you're watching a film. And this didn't look like a film to me in a lot of ways. It feels like it was filmed to not have those kinds of graininess and that kind of effect. So it made it so I felt like I could see everything very clearly. This was great in some landscape shots where I saw very beautiful vistas that were probably captured in camera. But then when things were not captured in camera, or when the set wasn't real or something like that, it also made it very obvious because I could see it all so clearly. This sometimes made the sets feel tacky in some areas. Sometimes the lighting looked a little weird and the filters that they just slapped on to be like, look, it's nighttime, it's blue, which a lot of people do, but it was made, I feel like, even more obvious. The CGI is just totally hit or miss. Like some things look really cool, like the swirling double helix into the sky from episode 1, but in that same episode, Moraine throwing fireballs looks like a PlayStation 2 animation. There's also some really bad editing choices in there that sometimes make things look extra weird and how the camera's spinning around and slicing between things. Or they sometimes butcher the plot, it feels like, but I don't know how much of that was time restrictions and some of the other issues that they bumped into. In terms of some of the visual fights, some are amazing, like just outright great, like episode 7 and some of episode 1, but other times it just kind of feels tacky again. On to the actors and characters. I found the characters to be pretty good and I liked most of the tropes that they were. I found that their introductions were very effective at making me know who they were supposed to be. You know, Matt's a gambler, rogue with a heart of gold kind of thing. Nynaeve is the leader, elder, who's very quick-tempered and stubborn, however. You know, the Perrin is a broody, quiet guy who has a proclivity for violence but also wants to be a pacifist in some ways. You know, like these characters are pretty easily painted onto the screen. That said, the introductions, while effective at setting up the characters, were totally boring and often lacking any feeling of originality, like Rand walking down a path while his dad is like, let me tell you about something from your youth, audience. And then, you know, like the little gambling gag and they're all in a tavern and woohoo, it's a festival. Like all these things just felt so tired. And I know Wheel of Time was one of the forebears of a lot of tropes in fantasy, and I understand that, but it still just doesn't compare, I think, to a lot of the things that we've seen recently. I mean, Game of Thrones starts with like this kind of archery scene where you kind of get to know the characters very quickly, and then they move off into that beheading scene where suddenly, you know, you're learning so much about the tone of the world, the characters' relationships, it has advanced the plot, and most of all, it was interesting with good dialogue. I felt like most of the scenes in Wheel of Time accomplished one or two of these things at a time at most, and was often done in the least interesting way possible. Funnily enough, the plot itself also felt rushed through episodes 1 and 2, but I also wouldn't have wanted to slow down anymore during these points because I would have just been even more bored. So while the plot was rocketing forward, I was also not interested or drawn into the world quite yet. I felt like the actors playing these characters as well were decent. I mean, obviously, Rosamund Pike, everyone's been singing her praises. She's obviously a beast. And the others, while not quite up to her level, I felt like when given the opportunity to deliver in these scenes, they largely did it, minus a couple awkward, like, third wheel, everyone kind of get angry at each other in this love triangle situation. But, like, that wasn't really, I felt like the actor's fault. That was some of just, like, the scene and what it was supposed to be, so. Episode 3 and 4, however, were my favorite for this reason because we finally slowed down and were given time to breathe with the characters and feel them in this world. And I was really enjoying a lot of the emotional beats that they had during this time as well. And they paid off well, and there was also some good action and combat. And I felt like the show was really starting to settle into its groove after being like, okay, it had a lot to get off the ground in episodes 1 and 2. I get it, whatever. But then, as soon as episode 4 ends, we're just rocketing forwards again. And, I just never really felt like the plot or world building hit the mark to draw me in, and the characters weren't given the time to do that as well. One of the many reasons I felt like I wasn't getting invested into the characters or the world was there was just way too much focus on things other than the main characters and their plots in setting up for future stuff. And I'm not just talking about some of the side plots, though I will hit those in the spoiler section in a second here, but I just also mean like the things that they were choosing to spend time building upon were things that were not necessarily immediately plot relevant. There was so much about setting up for future seasons, and I'm sure people who read the books saw those little moments and were like, oh, it's this for this reason, that's gonna be so cool to see the payoff here or something. But for me, who has not read the books, I'm just like, why do I care about this? But why? That's going to do it for the non-spoiler section because I really want to get into some of the things that didn't land specifically for me, especially when we start talking about the characters and some of the reasons why not, as well as the show as a whole. I really need to start going into details. So, starting off, on this point about focusing on the wrong things in the show, let alone the world-building elements, the characters, like, they just never gave them a chance to breathe, and instead they gave us like a full episode of a sad boy warder who's going to die and have no plot relevance. It was like the kind of episode you would expect to see in like season 4 of a show when they're trying to pad it out and not sprinting through and cutting a whole month of adventures out of the show. This was such a baffling decision that added quite literally nothing to the show in my mind, that I just wish I didn't see that. And instead we got some development for the characters, some training cycles where Nynaeve and Egwene are trying to master their channeling powers as they're getting taught, and then we're learning more about the magic system and maybe some about the Aes Sedai and some stuff like that. You know, I would have loved to have seen Rand and Matt and Perrin like learning skills as they're out in the world instead of just kind of like being dragged along like lifeless corpses. I would love for anything other than that episode 5. Character arcs are non-existent for the most part. I mean, Rand's arc for the whole season seems to be trusting Moraine a little bit and letting go of his love for Egwene. I guess that's pretty much all he does. Perrin and Matt effectively do nothing but mope or be sad or angry / sick. I understand that they're also a bit of a decoy for like, is it Rand or not? But like, it didn't really ever feel like a question. Even for my girlfriend who did not read the books or was not spoiled, like it was pretty obvious because they tried so hard to take the focus off Rand that it became back on Rand again. The characters who do things and have character arcs like Egwene and Nynaeve also don't really have to work for them in any sense for their powers or their gifts or their things. There's no training, there's no stakes. I would compare this to Ciri in The Witcher season 2, where like a decent portion of that season is her getting to Kaer Morhen and starting to do Witcher training. And you have multiple scenes of her learning to do this stuff and actively trying and failing and then making progress. Egwene and Nynaeve are just Giga Chads whenever they need to be, and I know that it doesn't feel like there's any stakes because as soon as there's a problem, they just need their next emotional outburst before they're able to deal with it. There's also not really an emotional payoff because I didn't watch them struggle to learn this talent that they innately have, which I'm fine with. I'm totally fine with Mary Sue characters. Like, I love both, okay? Like, I'm totally fine with it, but I just didn't see them ever train or practice or do anything. One of the biggest problems that this show faces over the course of the season relates to character as well as arc and plot arc is who is the villain / antagonist. Yes, I know it's the Dark One. It beat me over the head with that. I get it. But we don't get any perspective from the bad guys, and the conflict that you do get out of them is largely missing any sort of personal connection. You know, like in Lord of the Rings, we watch Sauron basically harass Frodo every time he puts the ring on. There's the big burning eye and all this stuff that is just beaten into your head and be like, this is the enemy and he's doing these things. And even in that, we see the Nazgul actively harm him when they're hunting him, and he gets stabbed once, and they have to fend them off a couple of times and run away. Or Saruman's betrayal. Like, Lord of the Rings is rife with active antagonists on screen. It also wasn't like Game of Thrones, which gave us perspective on the Lannisters, as they have their own plots to throw against the Starks, and we get to watch both sides kind of tumble back and forth. In Wheel of Time, the Faes just kind of appear and disappear and screech at us, but they don't really accomplish anything. We don't understand their thoughts at all, if they even have those. They kind of just, "Rah, go minions," and the minions kind of show up and fight, but it's never a personal battle. I mean, I don't think we see the fade after Tom or Thom or whatever his name is, like, fights that one off. He doesn't really accomplish anything. There are plenty of characters who are at cross purposes with our own, but that's really not an antagonist. Liandrin had her own view of how the world was supposed to be and was a bit of an ass, but she wasn't really actively trying to harm our characters. Logain is kind of that way, but he's dealt with very quickly, and he doesn't have a through line throughout the entire course of the season, and it's hard to say exactly how evil he was intending to be. Padan Fain is clearly evil, but he's in the background for most of the season, just kind of like slinking around. You have to play Where's Waldo to even notice him. Bernie Eisman shows up twice, maybe, before the finale, you know, and he kind of just like sticks a bat in Rand's mouth. It wasn't really too antagonistic, I would say. The Dark One is mentioned quite a bit, and you assume that he's kind of the mastermind behind all the things going on, but it's so passive and in the distance that I don't really feel the threat that he's giving to the characters, because it's just so distant. And we don't really understand his machinations at all. It's just kind of things happening. Unlike, you know, in Lord of the Rings, the villain is very clearly given reasons to attack at each time that there's an army showing up. This brings me to the biggest problem I had with the show, which is just the inconsistency. It was so hard to get invested into the world and the plot and everything going on when there was something that pretty much knocked me out pretty hard in every single episode. And some of it is some minor stuff, and some is some pretty major. For example, something that just made my eyes roll out of my head was in episode 5, where Nynaeve is talking to Liandrin, and Nynaeve has no reason to trust Liandrin, no reason to do anything she suggests, and Liandrin, for no reason, is like, "Why don't you check out the persimmons in the garden?" And then we get a hard cut to Loyal bringing Nynaeve in and being like, "Hey, I found her in the garden." And we just have to make so many mental leaps as an audience to accept everything we just saw there, that, like, for some reason Nynaeve trusts her. For some reason Nynaeve then goes to the garden. Loyal, we don't really get why. Like, Ogier are kind of important, but they don't really say. What are the Ogier? They're the builders. What are they? Don't worry about it. They get access to the garden. He found her, knew it was her, even though we're in a major city and we don't really know how big travel is in this world. Is it really that strange to find a woman with the braids of the two rivers? Okay, but even if you did see that, Nynaeve's now going to trust this guy. He's like, "I know Rand. Hey, you're getting hunted by the dark evil lord, but you're going to trust this random guy." And then she's going to follow them to Rand. And then, yeah, I mean, like, there's like, yes, maybe it makes some sense, but you cut out so much of that story and slap these two scenes together that, like, immediately I was like, wow, this is the writer having to get character from situation 1 to situation 2. With no subtlety involved. And it just slaps me out of the episode because I feel the hand of the writer so strongly. Some people, it might not bother them, but this is all over the Wheel of Time. Pretty much every episode has moments like this that make it so hard for me to get invested, because it's lacking the logical internal scene-to-scene consistency that the other great fantasy shows have, and even shows in general. Rand's dragon realization, just like getting up out of bed and shooting arrows, was a big question mark for me. Like, it wasn't done in some climactic way. It wasn't even like understated, like we saw something really push him into that moment. We're just shown him channeling in a bunch of situations where they lied to us and didn't show those channeling moments before. That just like wasn't shown to the viewer, so we had no way of knowing those. And then we get a scene with his dad that happened before, but we never were shown that either. They just hid a bunch of stuff from us to try and make this reveal work, which it didn't. Also, where did Loyal go in episode 7? He comes out of the ways and just like disappears until he's needed to come back. Episode 8 is its own beast to tackle. The battle doesn't feel real at all. This is one of the biggest complaints anyone has about fantasy battles, is there's just nothing that makes me believe that this is a real encampment fortification thing on the wall. There's no armaments, you know, designed to fight in depth or anything. There's just like some slits where they shoot out of, and that's it. There's not actually any physical combat shown. They just kind of like, all right, well, they made it to the wall and they died. If channelers are this strong, why aren't channelers at the wall helping? Why did they hold them in reserve? You know, like, I understand keeping most of the women back if that's the idea, but like maybe bring the channelers who can blow up hordes of them with you at once. I don't know, just none of it seems real. Like, it's just so hard to believe. I don't know if this is how it is in the books, but at least on screen, I just can't believe that this is actually happening in any way. Perrin thinks he sees something, so he leaves to follow it, and we get like one random shot of him following something, but then he comes back to just where he was a second ago, and everyone's dead, and now Padan Fain has the horn. I fully acknowledge that this show had a lot of problems it had to deal with in terms of COVID, in terms of the actor who played Matt leaving. I fully acknowledge that these things hurt the production of this show, but at the same time, I can't pretend that these problems don't exist. Rand as the dragon was just anticlimactic. We were told that the Dragon Reborn's power will be like that of the raging sun. Nothing he did was as cool as literally every other channeler we saw in the show. Even like the random green ones were cooler. Logain was way cooler. Despite how much they hyped what Rand's power was going to be, we didn't see it. And on top of that fact, he had that little doohickey, which is supposed to increase his power by 100 times. And he just kind of uses it to be like, go away to the Dark One. And it doesn't look cool. The camera's spinning awkwardly and they're getting these like weird combined shots or something. I don't get why it had to do that. Probably because they realized it wasn't climactic looking and they were doing anything they could at that point. It just felt like the only thing that mattered there was the decision he made to not go with his reality of changing Egwene's personality, which is fine from a narrative level. It just didn't match the entire setup of what the Dragon Reborn was going to be like throughout the entire season. And even in the same episode about using this thing that increased his power by 100 times to battle the Dark One, like, I understand you can tell me it mattered, but it didn't visually seem that important. There's also the other problem about bringing people back from life randomly and all this stuff, just standing randomly in the middle of the field and like the visuals behind them looking weird. Like, just everything looks a little weird. At the end of the day, when reflecting back on this season and what the show tried to do, the question I raised for myself is, what did this show do better that I hadn't seen before? It tried with the Aes Sedai, but didn't really have the complicated plot and politics that came with Game of Thrones. It tried to have immersive world building, but really didn't have anything that was as cool or interesting as the good of evil fight in Lord of the Rings. It tried to make really compelling characters, but didn't have any sort of interesting relationship or fun that you kind of see between Geralt and Ciri in season 2 of The Witcher, which again, I'll do a review on that soon. You'll see I don't love that show either, but at least it had a strong point. It tried to make magic look really cool, but didn't do anything better in terms of the action scenes that you would have seen in any Marvel flick. It's substantially worse than those, actually. I always imagined, as an outsider looking in at the fandom of Wheel of Time in fantasy circles, was that it was the ultimate Chosen One survivor story that took on a fairly realistic approach of the trauma that would come from that burden, as well as convincing the world to do that. But they tried so hard to bury the lead of who the Chosen One was that it left with nothing really to say by the end of the season. I give the first season of Wheel of Time a very lukewarm 6 out of 10. The show definitely has some high moments, and going forward in the future, there's a possibility that they iron out a lot of the consistency issues here in the first season. But as it stands now, the strange editing, the effects, the exposition, the writing, character arcs, all of that combines to make this show very tough to recommend to anyone who's not just simply looking for another fantasy show to throw on in the background. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm sorry if I was a little harsh here, but just given the goals of what this show was trying to be, I felt like I had to give my honest take on it. If you liked the video, leave a comment, a like, a subscription, please. There'll be a lot more videos coming in the future. I have another fantasy show that just dropped, season 2 of The Witcher, that'll be coming out, as well as some non-fantasy reviews as well in the short future. Don't look up, maybe coming your way.